Welcome into the PFN Bengals podcast. I am Dallas Robinson. He is Jay Morrison. Jay, we've got Bengals OTAs. It's phase 3 of the offseason program. You were in attendance for day 1 of OTAs yesterday. We've got some news coming out of this day of practice. Jamar Chase was not there. T. Higgins was not there. We've got a couple other Bengals veterans were not there. But Jay, you saw all the sights and sounds. You saw Joe Burrow throwing for the first time since wrist surgery. What are your takeaways, your number one takeaways? How did Burrow look? Just give me the kind of rundown of like everything that you saw yesterday at the first day of Bengals OTAs.
Yeah, we've seen him throw since surgery, but it's always been on routes on air.
Right.
Yesterday was the first time we saw 7-on-7 where he had to be more accurate and put it in smaller windows, and he did. He looked great. Was 7 of 10 on his throws, and one was a drop. So he looked really sharp. A lot of zip on the ball. It's hard to glean too much from 7-on-7, and it was such a small period. Most of what they were doing was position drills and routes on air and install, but it was a progression. You're seeing a little bit more, and I thought Burrow looked great. And just to preface it, if he didn't, I don't think it would have been cause for concern, because we know he's coming off of wrist surgery and this is a progression. But the fact that he did look so close to who he is, I think is a great sign for Bengals fans and for the team and for Joe himself. He really was throwing the ball well. The rest of it, it's almost, what they say, football or underwear drills like the combine, right, and wearing jerseys and shorts, and they did have helmets yesterday. That was an upgrade, but it's hard to glean a lot from what you're actually seeing X's and O's wise. But you do learn something about where they're lining guys up and who's playing where and that type of thing. I think that's where the real value comes in watching these OTAs, and we'll get a chance to do it again next week. And then the following week, 3 days of it during the mandatory minicamp. And that's when, you would expect Jamar Chase would be in attendance, because if he's not, he's going to get fined. Now, maybe he does still skip it and take the fine, but I wouldn't think that would be the case. Don't think we're going to see T. Higgins for quite some time, but Sheldon Rankins and Trent Brown fall in that same category. They're under contract. Minicamp is mandatory. They can be fined if they're not there. So I think that's when you're going to see 3 of the 4 guys that we're missing be present for the on-field work. Yeah.
And I think there's a lot to unpack there. And what you said there, we should have a massive disclaimer, I think, about talking about any performance from these OTAs, right? Because it is, you're right, it is the underwear Olympics. It's hard to glean anything directly from what we see, but I did want to talk about the few guys who were missing. So we didn't expect T. Higgins, right? As long as he doesn't sign his franchise tag, he literally cannot participate.
Yeah.
Wouldn't expect him until, I would think, before the preseason, maybe the preseason, if he follows the Jesse Bates plan. I think Jesse Bates showed up, right before game 2 of that preseason when he was
at 2 days after the second game, he signed his tag.
Yeah, so I think we could see a similar timeline there. I'm curious your thoughts on why Trent Brown and Sheldon Rankins aren't here. I don't think it's a big deal in any capacity. They're veterans, but it is interesting to me. I'm sure they're getting their work in, wherever they may be, but it is interesting. 2 guys who just signed, 2 guys who maybe would want to get to know their teammates and their coaches, but it is interesting to me that they're not here. Again, not mandatory. It's not going to affect them, but I just thought that was interesting that they're not participating.
Yeah, and it's kind of been Rankin's MO through his career to sit out the voluntary stuff and do work out at home, and it is a little different because they're on new teams now and learning the scheme. That part you would think is important, but Zach Taylor didn't seem bothered by it. He's like, these guys are veterans. Those 2, Rankins and Brown, 17 combined seasons in the NFL. They're veterans. They know how to get ready. Zach said they have everything they need. They have the playbook, so they can do all the mental reps and all of that. So yeah, it'd be better if they were here, but the fact that they're not is not, it's not anything to be worried about. It is interesting that Trent Brown was scheduled to throw out the first pitch at the Reds game last night, and he was listed as a scratch for travel issues. So maybe he was planning on being back for that yesterday. You see this a lot on Memorial Day weekend where the guys push it. They try to extend that weekend as long as possible and take Monday night flights back and then get there for the Tuesday practice. And sometimes, flights get canceled, delayed, whatever the case is. Amarius Mims, interestingly enough, who's stepping in for Trent Brown at right tackle in these practices, stepped in for him last night and threw out the first pitch. So we'll see next week if Trent Brown's here. But again, it's nothing to be alarmed about. Same with Jamar Chase. Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, they've got that rapport with Burrow. They know the scheme, even though there's a new offensive coordinator in Dan Pitcher. Both those guys as receivers, I think, could show up on the Wednesday before the Patriots opener and step right in and be good to go. So nothing really to be concerned about there. It's we saw Jonah Williams wasn't it voluntary stuff last year, came in for mandatory minicamp, put his head down, had a fantastic season. Jesse Bates 2 years ago, same thing, waited even longer. Like you said, didn't come back till after the second preseason game. He missed all this stuff. There is a lot more on the plate for a safety and missing that part of the offseason. It can put you behind a little bit, but we've seen guys do this in the past, veterans. They know what they're doing, and ideally you'd like to have all 87 of them present, but 83 out of 87 is not a bad percentage, as Zach pointed out. Zach Taylor, he was very happy with the number of guys they do have, and he wanted to focus on the guys that were here and not the guys that weren't.
And it's not the worst thing in the world that if Trent Brown is not participating, that Amarius Mims does get those extra reps, that if Sheldon Rankins is not participating, then Chris Jenkins and McKinley Jackson get those extra reps. It's not the worst thing in the world, like to not have those guys present and let the rookies get those snaps that otherwise they might not have. So I think that's really important. Going back to Burrow for a second, I'm just going to read directly from Jay's excellent article. I know I'm biased here, but Jay did an excellent job covering these OTAs. I think better than anybody else in the Bengals beat.
Thanks.
Zach Taylor talking about Joe Burrow said, I feel really good about where he's at. He's been accurate. He's been on time. He's throwing with great velocity and power. You'd have to ask him what he thinks of his performance exactly, but I like what we see right now. So, I mean, it's positive. It's positive. I think that's what we kind of all expected going into OTAs. Jay, you wrote about the offensive and defensive plays of the day. A couple of great clips that you put in your articles you tweeted out. Trenton Irwin out fighting Mike Hilton for a contested catch near the sideline and then going up and signaling the first down against Hilton. I think that was a great play. And then DJ Turner almost getting an interception off of Joe Burrow, going up high and kind of batting the ball down. It seemed like he was a little displeased that he didn't come down with that interception, but still a very good play. As you look at those cornerback situations, Jay, did you notice anything in the battle between DJ Turner and Dax Hill? How is it looking at corner? Like, is DJ Turner, is he going to just get that job? Is Dax Hill going to give him a real run for his money? Did you see anything just in terms of lining up and who was playing yesterday that kind of gives you some insight into that battle?
Yeah, I think when we get into training camp, we're going to see those guys probably split first team reps. But right now, just getting going, it was DJ with the ones, and then Dax was coming in with the twos, and that it's a little interesting because it does feel like it's an open competition. But again, it's just a handful of reps. So I just, for the continuity sake of it, I think that's why they did it that way. It was interesting. Cam Taylor-Britt stayed out and ran with the twos as well. I think, just because they're a little short on bodies right now, and same at safety, that it was, Von Bell was with the first team, Jordan Battle with the second team, but Geno Stone ran with the ones and the twos because they're really thin at safety right now. Tyson Anderson's still on the rehab field. And so you never read too much into first team, second team, but it's the first time we've gotten any kind of look at it. So we are going to overanalyze it and break it down. And for just from yesterday, DJ running with the ones, I would, like I said, expect that to probably continue. Maybe in minicamp they do a little more, and maybe Dax does get some first team reps, but he's learning a new position, and it probably suits him better to, not that it's a huge drop off, especially when you're talking about T and Jamar not being here, the guys that are running ones and twos, it's not a huge drop off, but just to let him kind of ease in and run with the twos and get his footing, so to speak, as a cornerback. That made sense.
Yeah. I'm interested to see just how open of a battle that is. Like, it seems like DJ Turner has the upper hand. Is that going to what does Dax Hill have to do to really work himself into that battle is something I'm going to be watching, I think, as these practices progress. Jay, anything else you noticed? I think before we kind of move on here from OTAs, it's like we talked about. It's hard to read too much into what you see as long as everyone stays healthy and you're seeing what you're supposed to see. I think it's mostly good. I thought it was interesting. If you had any thoughts on what the report that came out yesterday that the NFLPA is talking about totally overhauling this offseason program and basically getting rid of OTAs, getting rid of this kind of early spring workout, and then extending training camp and kind of moving it back. So it's a longer ramp up period, maybe starting in June, longer ramp up, and kind of stopping these breaks that happen now where players go on vacation, coaches go on vacation. It'd be a pretty big overhaul, I think. And it's curious, the NFLPA, it seems like they're pushing for it. I wonder what coaches think if it's going to result in lost practice time or not. I don't know if you talked about that with any of the players yesterday, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on what the Bengals might think of that, if how that would kind of change how they go through their offseason program if the NFLPA was to do that. And it sounds like that's something that could happen as soon as next year, that the offseason program could be changed as soon as 2025. So I wonder how the Bengals might adjust if that does happen.
Yeah, the coaches obviously wouldn't like it. A couple of the players were asked about it. There was obvious a couple of the reporters were doing that story, a couple of TVs, and they were asking. And I think a lot of times, when it was happened, the players didn't quite understand the question. They were more about, why are OTAs valuable is how they were answering it, as opposed to, do you think they should just get rid of them and go with what you said, the earlier ramp up to camp? I don't know. I think that's part of the reason you see some of these guys not showing up for the voluntary stuff, because they do want that the season ends and they want that long break. They have families. They want to hang out with their kids, and some of them, Logan Wilson's having a charity softball tournament Saturday, and Tanner Hudson's having a charity golf tournament in Nashville. And, a few of the players I talked to, I asked if they were going, and they're like, no, it's family weekend. And they would, as much as they would like to support their teammates, it's that time is valuable. So it'll be interesting to see. I would assume the NFLPA has to put it to vote. And I would think you would probably get mixed reaction. I know the coaches would like to keep it the way it is. But they've been shrinking for a long time what they can actually do at this time of year. So it seems like a natural progression just to kind of wean away from it and go to the longer ramp up. But it was really nice yesterday. It was 70 degrees. It's one of those careful what you're wishing for if you're wanting to come back in mid to late June. That's going to be a lot of hot practices, although most of these teams have indoor facilities, but when you're dealing with a roster of 90 people, you need to be outside because you need the multiple fields. You need to have people in different areas doing different things. So a lot of stuff to take into consideration there. No one's going to ask the media. I like the way it is. I like having some things to write about it in May, but we'll see how it plays out.
All right. For the next half of this show, we are going to do a draft. Now, Jay and I, we love to do drafts on the show. I don't know what draft this is, what number this is for us, but we love to do them. We're going to do a free agent draft. We've talked about on this show before that maybe the Bengals should get a little more active in summer free agency. Maybe they should go out and fill some gaps that they have in these summer months. We've seen other teams in the division, like the Ravens, they've just come away with excellent free agent signings in May, June, July. You find veterans who can end up contributing throughout the year and play a lot of snaps and have a big role. So that's something that we've been talking about the Bengals could do to fill some of these gaps. So we're just going to look over what free agents are on the board still as we enter. I mean, it's almost June. We're almost to June. It's almost past June 1. Which free agents are on the board? Which ones could fit with the Bengals? So Jay and I are going to do a little draft here. I'm going to share our screen. So those of you that are watching on YouTube can kind of follow along at home. Add this here. So we've got 4 positions that we're going to consider from. We don't think the Bengals are going to go out and sign a quarterback at this point. We don't think the Bengals are going to go out and sign a wide receiver. We do think that, running back, interior offensive line, defensive line, and defensive back could maybe be all on the table here in these coming months. So what we're going to do, Jay and I are going to draft 2 players each. We're going to go snake format, and we're just going to try and pick some free agents who could fit what the Bengals are looking for at these 4 positions. It's pretty simple. And the way we're going to score it is if anybody gets any of these players, we get points. And if they don't, then they don't. The odds of the Bengals actually signing any of the guys we pick is over under is probably on 0.5. If we get one, we'll be probably happy with it. But I do think it's a valuable exercise to just kind of do one last look at this free agent market see where the Bengals gaps are and see which of these players might fit in. Jay, are you excited for this draft?
I am. I spent way too much time looking over these guys. And it is worth noting that, last year they had some openings. They weren't at 90, and they didn't sign anybody after Trevor Siemian on May 3rd. And they went into camp below the limit. And so the year before they were low, and they signed some guys right before the start of camp. They signed Dominique Davis, who was still a Bengal. They signed Raymond Johnson, who was with the Lions last year. And they signed Tigray Scales, a linebacker from Indiana who played locally in Cincinnati at Coleraine High School. He's no longer on a team, but that was like a day or two before training camp. So you mentioned the odds maybe being low of them signing any of the guys we picked. The odds could be low. They don't sign anybody. They're at 87 right now. But there are, I think what they look for here is not necessarily ticking off and looking at best available, because a lot like a Xavier Howard type of player, he would be great to add to the room, but he's a guy that's been a starter his whole career, and you don't want somebody coming in and then they're not in that role and they're forced, and maybe he wins it, but they like what they have in Dax and DJ Turner, and they want one of those guys to win it and be a long-term solution. So I think that's more the direction they kind of would be looking, is these guys that can be role players, that have been role players, and maybe a guy that can sign a 1-year prove it deal and come in and get some playing time and turn that into a bigger contract next year. They have the money to sign some more expensive guys, but I don't think that would be the direction they would go. If they were interested in those guys, I think they would already be here. But it's still fun to kind of look at some of these guys that are available and see how maybe they would fit if the Bengals went in that direction.
Yeah, the Bengals have $23 million or so in cap space remaining. And you're right, Jay, that's kind of the tack that I took too, was yes, it's not necessarily just, okay, the Bengals need this position. Who's the top rated free agent? Let's pair them. It's who are the realistic players that the Bengals might go after at this point. Now, I'm not saying Xavier Howard's not on my list, because he absolutely is, and he might be relatively high on my list. But I take your point that they're probably not going to go out and sign like the tier 1 guy available at this point in the summer. All right. I'm going to take the first pick on this one because I believe Jay had the first pick on our last draft. I'm going to start with my first pick. And then the way we're doing this, we can pick any position, by the way. We're all picking running backs and interior offensive line. We can pick any of these 4 positions we want. I'm going to start with interior offensive line, and I'm going to go with a guy that the Bengals know pretty well, and that's Max Sharping. I don't think he's anywhere close to the best interior offensive lineman available, but I think he has familiarity with the Bengals. I think that if the Bengals get to a point later in the summer where Trey Hill and Matt Lee are not playing up to the level that they're hoping, I think Max Sharping could be a guy that they say, hey, let's come back on a 1-year veteran minimum deal. He doesn't really have the center flexibility, I think, that you're looking for. He's only played 12 snaps at center. Those were all last year when Ted Karras was out for a time, was it 1 drive or something? So he doesn't necessarily have that, but I think that familiarity could be enough where if the Bengals feel like they need one more interior offensive lineman in July, they call up Max Sharping and give him a 1-year deal. So he's my number 1 pick.
All right. I'm going to pick a guy that maybe might be on the top of some lists for best available at his position. Cam Akers, the running back, he's only 24, and I don't think Chris Evans is a lock for this roster by any means. Travion Williams has been here for a long time. I think that would be a solid gamble, a guy like that. And I know he's bounced around some. I'm not sure what the issues are, why he doesn't stick.
Well, and he is coming off the Achilles injury too.
When did that happen? It was in
November.
So
he was on my list too as like a guy who could be available later in the year too. Like if you sign him now. Yeah, and hope that he's available by November, December.
Put him on PUP. But I mean, of all these guys I was looking at all these positions, they're all like right at 30 plus 30. Yeah. There's a handful that are under 30, and he was the youngest by far at 24. I just thought that was a kind of a good flyer to take. my next
one, and played for Sean McVay, played for Kevin O'Connell, so he's already got the familiarity with the offense. He was on my list too. I think my one question was, he kind of got run out of town in Los Angeles from the Rams, like demanded to be be Nobody wanted him. I do wonder, it's like, does Zach Taylor call up Sean McVay and try to get the intel on Cam Akers, and maybe the vibes aren't so great with that one. But then again, he did end up in Minnesota with Kevin O'Connell, who obviously has a Sean McVay connection. So there's lots going on there where I think that does make sense as a pick.
Yeah. And that's funny you say that, because this was my next pick is because it's a guy, and maybe a lot of Bengals fans haven't even heard of this guy, but I thought that the coaching connection between Zach and, in this case, Matt LaFleur, he could call him up and get the real read on this guy. But safety Chandron Sullivan, he's only 27. He hasn't missed a game in the last 5 years. Now, he's only got 32 starts in that time, but last year was his first year where he wasn't a full-time starter, played 234 special team snaps. So he gives you special team value. He played for LaFleur in Green Bay. So that's a guy, they're just so thin at safety right now, especially with Tyson Anderson coming back. I talked about it earlier, why Geno Stone was playing first and second team reps yesterday. So that's a guy that a 27-year-old with starting experience in this league who would be very, very cheap and could be a nice depth piece at safety and on special teams.
And not that the Bengals necessarily need any more slot options, but he spent a lot of time in the slot too. Mm-hmm. So he's another depth piece on the interior there. I think it's a good pick. All right, I'm going to go with a running back as well. I'm going to go with Jerick McKinnon. I think he's, an older player, but doesn't necessarily have all the wear and tear that a running back of his age might usually have, because Jerick McKinnon wasn't a starting running back for most of his career. He's also had a lot of injuries, so that's why he's going to be cheap. He's a very good receiver. I think that's something the Bengals might be looking for. And I think this is a caveat that I would say with a lot of these players. It's maybe the Bengals will wait and see how their internal options look once we get to training camp. And if Chase Brown is not developing as a pass catcher, if Zach Moss isn't looking like he's being as quite as productive as a pass catcher as he was at times for the Colts, maybe you go out and get a guy like McKinnon who can be a good dump off option. He's been kind of hit or miss as a pass blocker, according to PFF. Like he's had some seasons where he's been outstanding, and then some seasons where it's like the brightest of red on PFF scale. And it's just, I will say I remember a lot of good Jerick McKinnon blocks where he's just like destroying incoming blitzers. So not to weigh my own personal memories too hard, but I do have memories of him just destroying incoming blitzers trying to go after Mahomes. So I will put McKinnon as kind of a veteran, lower tier RB3 option that they could consider later in this summer. For my next, as we're doing snake, I'll do one more pick here. I'm going to go Xavier Howard, Jay. I know we just talked about it, but I'm going to go with him. I think that there's too many connections, right? He has the experience with Lou Anarumo and Zach Taylor in Miami. He's got a lot of starts. He led the league in interceptions, I think 3 or 4 years ago. Very good ball production. I think he's pretty scheme versatile, which is good under Lou Anarumo, who likes to do a lot of different things. I think Xavier Howard has the football IQ to be able to instantly process what he needs to process and figure out how this defensive scheme works. You're right about the cost. Like I'm wondering what the price will be at this point. Like if we get to mid-July, if we get to training camp and Xavier Howard still doesn't have a team somewhere, I don't know what the price will be. I think it would be pretty low. A guy who's had injury issues, I don't know if is he 30? He's got to be close to 30. I would think it's got to be lower, less than $5 million. Maybe some incentives on playing time or something. You're right that you don't want to block opportunities for guys like DJ Turner, but you get to later in the summer and Xavier Howard's still out there on a cheap deal. I wouldn't be surprised if the Bengals take a chance. Yeah,
he's exactly 30. So, like I said, it probably wasn't likely, but you can't rule it out. And what you mentioned with McKinnon, I was stunned when I was slotting these guys to see that he was 32. I just had it in my mind that he was a much younger guy, and that's probably because of what you said, where he's never been that full-time guy, and he's had some injuries, and there's some things that have kind of slowed down his career. But I was really surprised to see he was that old. So while we're talking old, I'm going to take the oldest free agent available out there. It's total pie in the sky. They got the guys they wanted, Jenkins and Jackson. Now, why not take a flyer on 6'8" Calais Campbell, and just what he could do as a situational pass rusher. He's at the end of his career, obviously. He's never going to give you a big snap load, but he is a 100% great human being. He's been in this league for a long time. Obviously, he's 38, still chasing that first ring. I think that you get him in on a cheap deal and let him do that ring chasing for his final year. I mean, you put someone like that in the middle, pushing the pocket with that length, he could be a real weapon at times. And again, it's probably a pie in the sky, but it's fun to think about what he could do in this situation.
He is older, but 6.5 sacks, 17 QB hits last year, and played. He could so scheme versatile, so position versatile. Could absolutely play defensive tackle, but he was playing true edge for the Falcons last year, like true edge rusher at his size. He can do a lot of different things. Played for the Ravens for a long time, knows the division. In terms of like absolute like fit and upside and just a generational type player, I think Calais Campbell like has all of that for sure.
Yeah, it would be really fun, and it'd be a win for the Scribes because he would be a go-to guy in the locker room for sure. I'm going to go to the interior of the O-line and Ohio State connection, Pat Elflein. He's played some guard. He's played some center. I know they drafted Matt Lee. They like him a lot, but it's still, we've talked about it on past pods. We were surprised they waited as long as they did and didn't really address it. Didn't sign in much in undrafted free agency. So I could see someone like that. He's only 29, so he's been in the league since 2017. That would be a good one to kind of boost the depth on that interior of the offensive line. I liked your Sharping pick, but that one just seems, if he isn't here yet, then why wouldn't he be? Because of the history they already have, and bringing someone in fresh like Elflein could make sense.
No, I like it. I think that makes sense as well. I am going to go back to corner for my next pick because for me, I don't know about you, Jay, but like when I looked at these positions, I still do think corner is the position where they, if they're going to sign one guy, I think that's the spot. So I'm gonna go with one more early pick here at corner. I'm gonna go with Adoree Jackson.
Yeah.
Played for the Tennessee Titans and then just spent his last few years with the New York Giants. He's a guy, you talked about McKinnon being surprisingly old. Adoree Jackson to me was surprisingly young.
28.
Only 28.
I
I was thinking Adoree Jackson's like on his last legs here, and he has had injury issues. He's got a lot of snaps under his belt, but again, only 28 years old. This is a guy I think very much in the same vein as Howard, where he was probably hoping he would end up with a starting role this offseason. It doesn't look like that's necessarily happened. He's probably waiting for a team to suffer a cornerback injury, and he can find some team where he go out and start. If that doesn't happen by July, maybe he's interested in a team like the Bengals. Adoree Jackson hasn't necessarily played on a ton of good teams. Maybe he's interested in coming somewhere the Bengals where there could be an opportunity to start. There could be an opportunity to get snaps in the event of an injury. And you're playing on a good team who's going to have a lot of primetime games, a lot of big games. You're going to get your name out there if you get on the field. It's going to give a guy like Adoree Jackson that chance to get one more significant contract before he turns 30. I think he'd be a good fit here on the Bengals.
Yep, I like that one.
And then I've got one more pick. I'm going to go back to running back. We're going with older free agents. So I'm going to go with a pretty old running back. I'm going to go with Latavius Murray. Okay. I was kind of impressed by what Latavius Murray did last year for the Buffalo Bills. I was looking at his stats today. He had a 57% rushing success rate. And I'm like, oh, that's pretty high. How good was that? Go into PFR's Stat Head, one of the most valuable tools out there. If you guys don't have Stat Head, make sure you get a subscription. Among running backs with 70 attempts, which, we'll set that line kind of low, third best rushing success rate in the league last year. So Latavius Murray was doing pretty well and pretty productive, pretty efficient for the Bills last year. He is 34 years old, but a guy who is a good pass blocker, has shown some receiving chops in the past. You're not asking him to come in here and take 300 carries. You're asking him to be around in the event of an injury and do a little bit. He's probably not going to do special teams at his age, which that could be a problem for a backup running back, but I'll put him as my next pick here, just on the off chance that the Bengals want to get a little more depth in the backfield.
Yeah, I'll stay at running back and go Kareem Hunt. He's still only 28, been around for a while. I know he's had some off the field issues, but he knows the division. He's great in the passing game, and we know how much Joe Burrow loves to hit the receivers. It's not like he's going to beat out Chase Brown or Zach Moss, but having two backs is better one. Having three like that is better than two, and you do protect yourself for some injury. And I most likely he probably gets a deal somewhere else for a little more money. But if teams shy away from him, a guy that knows the division would be extra motivated for those two games against Cleveland every year. I think he's worth taking a flyer on in this exercise. And then I'm torn between a couple guys here. This is great. I know.
It's a great podcast. Great podcast.
Yeah. I'll stick with kind of the same thing with cornerback that knows the division well. Ahkello Witherspoon, only 29, played in Pittsburgh, 57 career starts. He's a guy that has not been paid a lot. You could probably get him on a 1 year, $1 million type of deal. And he's got the experience. If things go sideways with the Turner and Dax Hill battle, maybe he's a guy that could step in. I didn't look at his splits. I'm not sure if he's played in the slot a lot or not, but if something happens with Mike Hilton, I think you automatically slide Dax Hill. That's probably his best spot. You would slide him over there, but then you would be looking for depth on the outside. And so I like that aspect of getting a guy that knows the division well and has starting experience in the league. Oh,
I like it a lot. Yeah. He played for the Rams last year, right? I think it was with the Rams, and had a really good season. I mean, a really good rebound season. A guy who I'm a little surprised has not found a job so far this year. And maybe that just speaks to cornerback, that teams don't really trust cornerbacks. That cornerback performance is so up and down that you get a guy like Witherspoon who does have a pretty good breakout year with the Rams. And maybe you just look and say, well, his entire career has been kind of up and down. Maybe we'll weigh that a little more because cornerback is such a finicky position. So I can understand that a little bit. You went with two guys there, Jay, that have AFC North experience, including Witherspoon, who spent some time with the Steelers. I'm going to go with a guy who spent the last couple of years with the Steelers as well. Going back to the interior offensive line, I'm going to go with Mason Cole, who was a full-time starting center for the Steelers for the last 2 years. Not a world beater. I'm not saying that this guy's going to come in and beat out Ted Karras. I don't even know for sure if he'd beat out Trey Hill or Matt Lee, but it's a guy who's got 73 career starts under his belt, knows the division, like I said, from these past few years, almost 4,500 snaps at center. Can play a little bit of guard, a little bit of action at guard throughout his career, but mostly a center. I just think it's a guy like if something happens to Ted Karras, God forbid, I mean, you're looking at Trey Hill or Matt Lee snapping the ball to Joe Burrow. I just don't know that's what you want on a team that's going for the Super Bowl. I'm just not sure that's what you want in the middle of your offensive line. I don't think Mason Cole is going to come in here and light up the world, but he's been in the NFL, he's been in this division. He knows what he's doing from a technical standpoint. I wouldn't be surprised if the Bengals want just a little more experience depth there on the interior. So I think Mason Cole kind of fits that bill.
Yeah, I like that one. I'm losing track here. Are we?
You need to pick one more interior offensive line and one defensive lineman. And
so I've got two, and then you've got two. Is that how it's working?
I've got two. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, we're actually. Yeah.
Do you have another one in this round? Because you should have one at the end, since you had one at the beginning, one at the end.
Is it my pick right now? Maybe it's my. Yeah, it's my pick right now. Yeah, you're right. It's my pick right now. All right. So I've got to pick another. I need to pick. Let's see, two more defensive linemen. I have not picked any defensive linemen, and that makes sense because I had them all pretty low on my list. Because for me, I think this is the position where the Bengals are probably okay. I mean, you spent two picks on defensive tackles. I think you're probably okay there, unless there's an injury. The Bengals are pretty solid at edge, again, barring an unforeseen injury. So I think this is the spot where I'd kind of be surprised if they do add a body. I'm going to go back on the familiarity route and just say Josh Tupou. And maybe that, the Bengals get to training camp and maybe McKinley Jackson just is not ready to be an NFL caliber nose tackle. I mean, we know that, at least according to the consensus boards, that McKinley Jackson was more like a 5th or 6th round pick. Maybe that's the case, and maybe he needs a little more development in year one. If that's so, maybe the Bengals go and get a guy in Josh Tupou who they know, who can play in that nose tackle position. again, I think it's a lot of the concerns that you mentioned before, Jay. If the Bengals wanted to re-sign him, why didn't they? They could have.
Yeah.
But if we get to a point and we see how these rookies are kind of progressing, and if maybe they're not quite ready, maybe the Bengals go out and say, Josh Tupou, come in, you'll compete for a spot. They can always stash him on the practice squad with the new practice squad rules. So I would be interested if Josh Tupou is still on the radar.
Yeah, and I thought he was solid here. I mean, for a guy that came in as an undrafted free agent, he crafted a pretty nice career here in Cincinnati, and he was solid. He was never spectacular, but he was solid when they counted on him. For my next pick, I'm gonna go back to a Buckeye on the offensive line. Nice. And it's not about the Ohio connection. It's more about this guy's only 25 years old. He was just a 3rd round pick a couple years ago. I think that's something that's worth taking a flyer on. It's Wyatt Davis, and he played for 3 teams last year. That's a bit of a red flag, but you're talking about bringing a guy in that is going to give you some depth on the offensive line. If he doesn't beat out a Trey Hill or any of those other guys on the interior of the offensive line that are backups, there's no loss. But you could get him really cheap and possibly find something. Now, just because he's a 3rd round pick doesn't mean the Bengals had a 3rd round grade on him. But generally, if you're getting a day 2 draft pick, I just think it'd be too soon to pull the plug on a guy like that a couple years into his career. So why not take a flyer? And then my last one would be on the interior of the defensive line. I don't know here.
It's tough.
It is.
Defensive line free agents were pretty thin.
They're all old. They're old. Yeah. And so I'll go with Brian Moore. He's only 28. It's just a flyer. I'm not even going to go into his credentials because it's probably not going to happen. I'm sorry, not Brian Moore, Brian Moan. But it's just, I need an 8th pick, and he's my 8th pick.
He was on I believe he was on the PUP list last year for quite a bit, because I remember doing our PUP list tracker at PFN, and I had him on there just about every week. So I think he's an interesting guy. I've got one more pick here. Yeah, exactly. He's due to be healthy. I'm going to go in the same lines and go for a younger guy here on the defensive line. I'll throw out some of my other options I had here. A guy, Mike Purcell, 33 years old, 330 pounds, true nose tackle. Same thinking as Josh Tupou. If McKinley Jackson is just not cutting it in training camp, maybe you bring a guy like that in. Lawrence Guy, 122 starts for the Patriots and other teams. A guy like Emmanuel Ogbah, who just got released down in Miami, 30 years old, can play inside, outside. I'm going to go with a younger guy, though. I'm going to go with Rasheem Green. He's played 29 career starts for Seattle, Houston, and Chicago. Had a career high of sacks back in 2021, 6.5 sacks. He's got youth on his side. He's got length on his side. Other than that, I don't think there's a ton of selling points. I think it would take an injury for the Bengals to go out and get a guy on the edge. But if something happens, again, God forbid, to Joseph Osai, who got hurt last year, or Cam Sample, or any of the Bengals edges, I think they could be interested in a big, strong young guy like Rasheem Green, who maybe has a little untapped potential, but at the very least has the experience I think that they could be looking for.
And we will see if we hit any of these.
Is there any other players you wanted to toss out? There were a couple other guys on my list that I had kind of like Steven Nelson. I brought him up a ton, the cornerback. I think he'd be a good fit. And then a couple of the other interior line options are still a little bit intriguing to me. Tyler Larson's got 36 career starts at center for Carolina and Washington, 32 years old. Connor McGovern, I think, is interesting. Now, there are 2 Connor McGoverns in the NFL, both of whom play interior offensive line. That's crazy. Both of whom played in the AFC East. It's very confusing. I'm talking about the one who's a little older. He's still a free agent. 91 career starts. He was the Jets starting center up until last year when he got a knee injury. Again, a guy who just has been there and we know can do it at some level. I just think if the Bengals want to have a contingency plan up front in the interior, I really do think they can consider one of these guys. The last one I'll say is Greg Van Roten, 34 years old. Really good season for the Raiders last year. Doesn't play center, which is a problem. He's pretty much guard only. On defense, I think the one guy we kind of left out was probably the biggest name is Stephon Gilmore, who is, he's won Defensive Player of the Year. Probably looking for a pretty significant contract. He's like him and Calais Campbell. I mean, are really the only guys on this list that I think could still command significant money at this point in the year. Maybe the Bengals get into training camp and say, DJ Turner, you're doing fine, but we're going to go out and get Stephon Gilmore, who's won Defensive Player of the Year. and we're going for the Super Bowl. We're going to go out and give him, $10 million on a 1-year contract. I think it's like a pie in the sky, absolute like dream scenario that I don't think is going to happen. But I do think Stephon Gilmore is probably the number one, premier free agent left on the board at this point.
Yeah, I think a guy like that's probably just waiting out an injury, waiting for a team to get desperate. There was an injury in camp, and then the team comes and gets him. The one leftover I had that it was kind of in line with Calais Campbell. It's Linval Joseph. He's 35, 170 career starts in the league. A 6'4", 329-pound guy that could be in the middle of the defensive line. But like you said, it was slim pickings in the defense.
No, I like that. And he's a guy, I believe, that signed along with the Eagles at midseason. Or was that last year, maybe the year before? But I think he's a guy he's come in and signed even during the season. So that's even like another area that we haven't even considered, looking farther down the road as in-season additions. But I think this was a good exercise to kind of just go over the last bit of free agents. And again, it's a pretty thin crop, but there are guys that can do stuff. And we saw like a guy like Dalton Reisner, who I think was on both of our lists heading into this exercise, that signed with the Vikings today. So teams are still making additions and trying to fortify their rosters going into the summer. And maybe the Bengals will do the same. And if they do, we'll come back and see how we did in this game. Jay, anything else before we sign off? Like you said, you'll be back at Bengals OTAs next week to cover one more day of when media is allowed to be there. But other than that, Jay will keep having his Bengals coverage on pfn.com. I will continue having our general NFL coverage. Anything else, Jay, before we sign off on this midweek edition of the PFN Bengals pod?
No, I'm looking forward. I'm going to Logan Wilson's softball tournament on Saturday, or softball. Yeah, I guess it's a softball game, charity game with a home run derby. A lot of Bengals are going to be there supporting Logan Wilson for his foundation, his charity. That's a lot of fun. I don't know that I'm going to write any stories off of it, but depending on where they put us, I plan on taking video of the home run derby and seeing if Joe Bocci can defend his crown. And I love it watching these guys play a different sport, because they are the elite football players in the world, and everything they do is so effortless and impressive. And it's crazy. You would think it would translate, and it does not. If you get a chance to go, you will be surprised. You'll be like, well, they look just like us playing softball. They throw the ball awkwardly. They swing awkwardly. Some of them will be really impressive. Yes. But some of them you will be surprised. I went to one a few years ago down at the Florence Freedom Stadium, and I was just stunned at how awkward some of these professional athletes looked when you put them in a different sport. So if you're not doing anything this weekend, follow along on my Twitter. Hopefully I'll have some videos of guys crushing the ball. They won't be hitting it out of the Dayton Dragons Stadium. They're going to have a makeshift fence. It's going to be much shorter than what the baseball players try to do, but home run derbies are fun, whether it's wiffle ball or whatever it is. So looking forward to that on Saturday.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun. We'll see. Todd Frazier won the home run derby back in the day, right? So for the Reds. So
it's one of the most electric moments I've ever been to in person. And it's so weird because it's just an exhibition, but because it was in Cincinnati, I was there covering it, and it was amazing. It was one of the vibe, the electricity from the hometown, the home crowd cheering him on, and then him actually pulling it off. It was one of the coolest things I've ever covered in my career.
Let's hope that the Logan Wilson softball game can live up to that. We'll see. We'll see if it gets to that level or not. All right. Well, everyone, check back next week. We'll have another episode for you next week. Thanks so much for listening on the PFN Bengals podcast.